Hello, Professor Annotated. This is my annotated bibliography blog where I'm going to present to you how did I arrive to some of the sources I'll be using for my research essay. So for the purpose of this presentation, I divided my research process into three. So I didn't really follow a specific order when I was doing my research. I just realized by the end of it that this is more or less the three main steps I took when I found points of connection and key terms when doing my research. So more or less, I first started doing an in-depth reading and analysis, especially on Franz Fanon Chapter 3, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. Then I identified connections and common points between the sources I used from the class and the ones I found by my own. And then I sort of try to do a broader analysis where I try to link the articles to the case study I decided to do for the research essay. So after we had a conversation about my research essay, I decided to explore Franz Fanon Chapter 3 of The Wretched of the Earth, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. So I wanted to immerse myself in the chapter and try to think about a case study that I could use to illustrate some of the concepts he develops. So I have to confess that when I read the chapter, it didn't make much sense to me. It was only until I picked a case study um, in West Africa, which is Ivory Coast, that I was able to sort of apply the concepts or ideas that he explains in the chapter. So, because I didn't grasp Fanon's central idea at first, I had to spend a good amount of time getting familiar with it. So I read Fanon's chapter several times. I highlighted, I made notes on some of the things he said. Again, this was just like my initial step. I wasn't really clear that much about what he meant. I just noticed some of the themes and some of the concepts that he developed, and that I knew I was going to try to apply and hoping to see more like how it the concepts applied in real life. So I was really drawn to this particular paragraph where he says that from nationalism, we have passed to ultranationalism, to chauvinism, and to racism. So I was really interested by that. I wanted to find out more what he meant by that and how come nationalism could develop into something so destructive. Since I had so many ideas in my mind, I think I was a bit straying away from Fanon's point. So that's why I decided to find additional sources or additional information that will complement my understanding of what he was saying. So I devoted some time to understanding finance, not only chapter 3, but also a little bit of um, the wretched of the earth in general. So I went into YouTube and listened to some videos that summarize the book. Um, I found a couple of videos that talk about chapter 3, which is very famous chapter in his book. And this allowed me to get a better sense of Fanon's theories, because I believe since he talks about so many different things, it's really easy to stray away from the central idea, which I believe is that national consciousness no longer reflect the hopes of the people it is supposed to represent. Instead, it became a tool used by the national middle class to appropriate the positions once held by the settlers. I believe there's some connection to Prashad's book, which I will talk about later on. So that's why I included both sources into my list of sources for my essay. Um, so I also researched a little bit more about Fanon's biography and found an interesting article that also talked about his life and his political leanings. This article allowed me to understand even more his writing and, in a way, some of the more radical views he has about decolonization, neocolonialism, and the flawed character of the national middle class. So, I think it was very interesting to learn about his participation in the French army and how he must have felt when experiencing racism within the French army or just experiencing how other African colonies were treated. I think it illustrates very much his language or his critique of the national middle class. Um, I can see in his language there is a lot of feeling, and I think it comes from the lived experiences he had throughout his life. So this is when I decided to go ahead and research more about my case study, which is Ivory Coast. I picked this country because he mentions it in chapter 3. However, he does mention other countries in West Africa, but I was just drawn to that quote or paragraph where when he mentions Ivory Coast and how nationalism sort of degraded into racism. So that's why I picked that one. And I found two articles that, uh, in my point of view, help illustrate from a historical point of view, but also a bit of sociological, what happened and what is it that Ivory Coast is an example of this, let's say, degradation of nationalism. So when researching about Ivory Coast, I went into SFU library catalog and started researching about the country in connection to other keywords I deemed useful. I didn't have much background about the country, so at first I couldn't find any article that connected to the ideas I was looking for. I found one that talked about native conversion into Islam in southern Ivory Coast. So this was very interesting. This is when in this article is where I first encountered the idea of Ivory which is an ideology and policy that hardened ideas about citizenship and belonging. I think this was very pertinent to understanding Fanon's critique of nationalism. So I went on and researched more about Ivorite in both the library catalog and JSTOR, where I found two articles that are the ones I picked for my essay. One is Alfred Babo's Ivory and Citizenship in Ivory Coast, and another one is by Richard Banega, Patriotism, Ethno-Nationalism, and Other African Modes of Self-Writing. So both articles focus on the concept of Ivory how it emerged, and what were the consequences for supposedly non-native Ivorians. However, Baba's analysis focuses on the legal aspects of the policy and how it affected immigrant and non-immigrant people alike. He clearly states that the policy emerged as a strategy to discredit elites, so some elites were trying to discredit others. And I picked this article because it made part of a bigger collection of essays from a book called Citizenship in Question, which I found interesting. and because Babo's experiences as a professor in Ivory Coast. So I picked Vanegas' article Patriotism, Ethno-Nationalism, and Other African Modes of Self-Writing because I found it was cited by the first article where I encountered the term of Ivory Tan, the one about native Ivorians which converted into Islam. And I also found that his analysis was very interesting because he not only finds that the elite's intervention contributed to hardening citizenship, like Babo stated, but he also thinks that the lack of Ivorian social imaginary and self-determination, which is caused by the first president of Ivory Coast, who suppressed any critique towards the French, because they decided that although they were independent now, they will keep close alliances with the French. He thinks that this lack of an independence movement was fueled then by an aggressive hatred towards immigrants and Southern Ivorians. So his critique is more sociological rather than only focused on political or economic factors. And finally, in my last section, broader insights and linking articles to case study, I decided to include two more articles that we read in class. So I did this mainly due to your suggestion the last time I talked about my research essay with you. And I could see that these two articles I chose, The Darker Nations, People History of the Third World, I decided to focus on the introduction, and Colonialism in Question, they both provided a more global analysis to the ideas I want to explore in my research essay, which more or less relate to the pervasive outcomes of the project of nationalism. Okay, so in Prashad's introduction of the Darker Nations, although it's a bit of a short introduction, I think it echoes to some of the ideas that Fanon discussed or analyzes in his chapter 3. So I think it allows me to locate my case study within the global arena and in relation to other third world countries that were looking for liberation and an alternative global order. So, like Fanon, Prashad traces the collapse of the Third World Project in the consolidation of power and hierarchies in the hands of elites. And finally, I decided to include Cooper's Chapter 6, States, Empires, and Political Imagination. This chapter is actually very, very long. It provides a lot of history. I may have to get back to it because it also has like many, many concepts, and I don't think I have like an opportunity to actually go through the whole chapter. However, I found that it provides me the opportunity to reflect and include another perspective, which is the perspective of the empires that subjected these colonies, and just try to understand how they didn't develop on a straight line, but how they actually had lots of limitations, negotiations they have to do in the colonial project. So I think his chapter demonstrates the limits of power as well as the shortcomings of colonization, which I think are also very important to highlight when talking about um, the colonies, just how they relate to one another and how they developed in relation to one another. So, in conclusion, I'm still reflecting on my sources and I continue to find links and connections the more I read them and analyze them. I'm happy to hear any of your suggestions since I know maybe this is a very broad topic, but I would like to include a little bit from different readings I signed in class rather than just focusing on explaining just a few aspects related to my case study. So this is all for now, and thank you very much for your attention.